Yeah, no, I think actually this was something that Norman and I talked about. So in 1986, my first research grant from the University of Tennessee for a whole $600, which paid for an airline ticket. And I stayed across the street where David owns a house across from Norman's house at the time. And we spent 10 days, and a lot of the conversation, for example, in the article that I helped to author with him about Luros, was the hat rack incident. And he had made a sculptural work that was in the faculty lunchroom that someone had mistook for a hat rack. And at first he was really mad at his colleague who couldn't clearly see that this was a work of art. And he came to understand that he needed to create a context for understanding the work. And that's where the narrative that accompanies the artifact is so important. You know, in the case of my work, I get to be the ancient Azudian potter who makes the vessel. I get to be the early 20th century lithographer who renders a shard of that vessel. And then I get to be the museum curator. So it covers kind of three periods in which I contextualize the shard in relationship to the development of ceramics from ancient Azudia, right? So, and it's much like the hat rack incident. And I think it's very much evident in the catalog that Norman put together documenting Luros in that he used that voice of the archaeologist or the curator to try to prompt the viewer to think about the artifact. And much like academic prose, it's speculative itself. So it becomes more authentic in a sense because of its aspects of speculation. And it recognizes that the work of art does not always speak for itself, that in some time, in some future context, someone is going to talk about it. And why shouldn't that be the artist herself, right?
Yes, and not only the artist herself, but artists often have to write didactics or blurbs or the dreaded artist statement for their work, and most of the time those have to be done very straight-faced in a very sort of specific way to rep the work to potential curators and buyers. But so I find one of the interesting things about so many fictive art projects, including both Norman's and yours, is the way in which the idea of the expert has been co-opted as a creative enterprise and a form of creative writing that takes many different voices, from the satirical, which we find in Norman's prose, to the poetic, which we also find in Norman's work, to the mock academic, but not satirical. Your academic writing is very, very plain and informative, and I think that you're making, again, the work seem more credible by writing about it in places like Leonardo.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, as a university professor, I'm also obliged to speak to the discipline. And so there's also the voice of talking about the work. And lots of times artists are asked to do that, but many of the same tools can be part of a fictive art project, right? Where you assume a different kind of voice. And one of the sections of your book that I really love, Antoinette, is the way you talk about various forms of pseudonymetry. And I love the analogy you use that someone who plagiarizes takes someone else's words and passes them off as their own, whereas lots of fictive artists create words that they attribute to others. And there's something really liberating about pretending to be someone else. Now, there are risks with that, and there are limitations with that. But it's sort of like a mask that can allow you to say a certain kind of truth you might not otherwise be able to speak to and address. I always recall in critiques as a student, talking about work as if I had never made it. And that's what you sort of want to achieve, that kind of objectivity. So the next step to pretending that you had never made it and you're talking about it and analyzing it just seems like a natural step and transition there.
Yeah, that's very true, isn't it? I noticed that you and a few other artists, not as many as one might think, have gone the extra step to become performers about the work and that take on the mantle of, say, a curator who speaks to the public. Iris Haussler does that. She doesn't do it herself, but she has docents doing it. But so there is a barrier that gets crossed. A lot of what one does in projects like these is one stays behind the out of sight of the public, making these things and then putting them out under pseudonyms, since you brought up this idea of pseudonymity. But when you perform as the director of the Hokes Archives or any of your other alter egos, you're right there in front of people. Can you talk about what it's like and how, if it's, what the difference is when you put yourself physically in the piece as a performer?
Well, it's particularly with the Association for Creative Zoology, I really took the project outside of the museum. And, you know, in 2007, up the road from here in Knoxville, the Creation Museum opened in Northern Kentucky. It's a natural history museum advocating for young Earth creationism. And just the year before, there was a Gallup poll that 2/3 of Republicans thought that creation science should be taught alongside evolution in our high schools. You know, so I started that project very mindful of these discourses in the public at large. And this connects back to the centaur that we brought here to the University of Tennessee. But I have colleagues at the university who taught courses in evolution and would go down to Dayton, Tennessee. 1925, the Butler Act was passed by the legislature here, outlawing the teaching of evolution in public schools and universities, including my university. So aspects of that project were an effort to engage with a broad public. You know, so I twice went to the Scopes Trial Festival, which happens the third week in July. You're welcome to come to Dayton, Tennessee to experience that, where they have theatrical reenactments of the original trial, where Williams Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow debate whether John Scopes had violated the state law. And there's lots of complexities to that. But the experience of showing my hybrid animals to people who believed in young Earth creationism, just as the experience of showing them to people who are evolutionists. I mean, that and trying to stay in character the whole time, it's pretty engaging. So I mean, that project really allowed me to perform it in a way, and in many ways, when you think about it, even a museum is a kind of narrative space for a kind of storytelling. A curator will tell you, you know, the text panel should be no longer than 80 words, you know, things like that. I mean, it is a narrative form. So fictive art, whether it's in the museum or at the Scopes Trial Festival, are all efforts to kind of engage with an audience in a way and tell a story.
Okay, well, speaking of stories, since you brought up the centaur, would you please tell the story of how that came into being and came to your university? Because I think it's a very interesting story and touches on a lot of these issues all at once.
So over my shoulder in my office, I'm pointing to it right here, are two files called mock documentation. And over the years, I have written to many artists, and in recent years, last couple decades, there have been younger artists who've written to me. And in the 80s, I had communications with a zoologist who studied lake trout at the University of Wisconsin, Oshkosh, who was also an artist. And he took human and equine bones and made a centaur burial. And it was presented at the Madison Arts Center and several other museums in the Midwest. And then he didn't know what to do with it. So he wrote to me wanting to know if I knew if I had the corner on the market for mock archaeology. And so a year later, I presented it along with a survey of other artists who invented cultures to a graduate seminar here at the University in Life Sciences. And my colleague, Neil Greenberg, inquired about the centaur. And I said, you know, he wants to sell it. And so the price was very reasonable. So we raised funds, bought it for the university. We put together a committee of faculty from classics, psychology, archaeology, theater. We built a case for it, and we got interest from the dean of the libraries. She wanted it in the library. So for 4 years, for example, we had luncheons where faculty presented the latest cutting edge Centaur research. Chiron, of course, is the model teacher of humanities and so forth. And so nowadays, this work of fictive art has been woven into the university. It's something, I mean, people think that I made it, but I helped to just essentially find a home for it here at the university. And I think it's an interesting example of the way fictive art can find homes in academic settings, that as artists, we're both outsiders and insiders in an academic context. And this is something that I could bring to the conversation as part of the culture of the University of Tennessee, which, has the largest adult male centaur in a university library east of the Mississippi. So to me, it's part of my legacy here as a faculty member, and I think it's a good example of the way the connections between artists who work in similar veins can help produce collaborations, and we can support each other that way.
I think it's a fantastic teachable object. I can very much imagine being 18 and not looking at that and not knowing if it was real and not being actually sure how you would determine it, given that it looks so authoritative, and right down to the different little didactic panels on the front of the case.
Well, it's part of campus tours, and we need to remind college students that just because it's in the nonfiction section of the library doesn't mean it's true, right?
Right. I want to ask a larger question about fictive art projects. In general, they tend to be expansive. People start with one idea and then they keep adding to it. I can imagine that with one civilization, you could keep building it out forever. There's nothing to say that you would necessarily have to be done with it. There's no normal or obvious termination point. So I'm wondering how you yourself decide that a project of this kind is done, or do you just get sick of them and abandon them? Or does it vary from project to project?
Well, there's no going back. I mean, my BFA thesis took 1 year, my MFA thesis. When I went to grad school, I knew what I was going to do for my thesis. I spent the whole 3 years working on it. Nowadays, projects take 8 to 12 years or something. I think part of it is I choose projects that have more potential complexity, but also they reach a certain point where they're kind of like a book. It's like it would be a scholar who decides, I have explored this topic and made a complete statement about it, and then I can sort of let it rest. So really, I'm a traveling exhibit agency, so I create these exhibits, I create them, and then they've traveled all over the country and to Canada and so forth. So part of it is to create a complete statement, but usually I've never really gone back to, I'm not making any more Azudian artifacts, because the next project sort of has its own kind of demands on your time and your commitment, so you can only have one project at a time. I had the folk art and the medical arts I did concurrently, but I prefer just to work on one project at a time.
You say you're not making more Azudian things, but as people always like to say to me, how can we believe a thing that you say? I do want to leave some time for audience questions. So I want to just pitch one final question to each of you, starting with Beauvais, since you're up at bat, so to speak, and then I'll ask David to pitch in. I'd like to get a sense, if you don't mind, what you're working on now. What do we have coming from you in the foreseeable future?
So in the studio, I'm working on the imaginary circus you mentioned, Circus Orbis, and the circus brings together many of the themes. I started this project at the American Academy in Rome during a 6-week affiliate residency, and it was really inspired by Baroque Rome. And really, what is the circus but Baroque? And I'm creating prints and ephemera from that circus, some pop-up books, banner paintings, but I'll be making other components to it. And it's the story of Thaddeus Evergood, who was our state gymnastics champion in Tennessee, who went to Rome as a street performer in 1908, and then came back and created this small circus. And Everett Ormsby Hoax was always looking for publishing, printing jobs. And so he started printing circus posters to support his scholarly publications. Yeah, so it's fun, and I'm seeing where it's taking me. Other than that, the other thing I'm working on with David is a symposium for Luros. I think you can put the URL in the chat, but we're inviting proposals for papers related to Luros, as well as papers by artists who are exploring themes of world making and fictive art. And we'll see what comes in. It'll be electronic symposium. One of the benefits of the pandemic is you learn how to do these things through Zoom interface. And I'm really excited to see how we can honor the legacy of Norman's work, but also think about ways of encouraging other fictive artists of whatever age to share their work.
Thank you very much, Beauvais. David, you know, we're aware here in this, Beauvais and I and you, that your father is somewhat under-recognized. And besides the symposium that Beauvais is organizing, I know that you're active in other projects to bring more attention to his work. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the things you have been planning and for Norman's work?
No, I'm happy to respond to what's a very important question for me at this point. I inherited Luros in all of its materiality, at the very least. And so one of my fundamental concerns is the ongoing protection, pure and simple, of the objects themselves. That's pretty well taken care of at the moment, but I stress at the moment. Then I think in terms of protection and preservation, which has more implications, obviously, in terms of possible approaches to what to do with the material. I had maybe 5 or 6 years ago thought that a next step would be some kind of book. I thought in terms of an artist monograph. This was before the 2 European exhibitions, that in particular the Istanbul Biennial that you had talked about. It would be wonderful if another Istanbul included about 120 of the roughly 150 objects that exist at Luros. It would be just wonderful to have another comprehensive exhibition, ideally in this country as well. I don't know how well the objects are going to hold up in terms of exhibition after exhibition. My partner in what we call the Luros Project, Linda Fisher, and I were much involved in the processing of the 120 objects that went to Istanbul. So we're very familiar now with them at a material level to begin with. We also brought photography and measurements and descriptions up to date, and everything is now available in the Civilization of Luros website, whereas the original catalog did not include images of the majority of the objects, although the black and white images were very good in that catalog. So, but the idea of a book has been subject to modification several times, and it's pretty clear to me now that what would be appropriate would be a collection of essays. And now with Beauvais' idea for a symposium, basically, which would involve essay writing in preparation for it, I'm hoping that this will be a step forward in the direction of ultimately a book. And I think that'll strengthen, I don't know how to put it, but Loris's position in relation to the goal of long-term preservation.
Yes, I certainly hope that is the case. So Gordy, I think this would be a good time to open the floor to audience questions for our two guests.
Well, great. We have some questions here in our chat, and I'll read those to you. Thomas Doyle asked Beauvais, Beauvais, you spoke about an upcoming symposium about fictive art and mentioned posting the URL in the chat. Can you do that for us?
I did post it. Let me post it again.
Oh, great. Well, let's jump to Iris Haussler. She's also a fictive artist, and she asked the question, Beauvais, great, amazing work in storytelling. I'm curious if you've ever heard of Wolpertingers.
I have. I went to Munich in 2019 to retrace to stalk Alois Sennefelder, who was the inventor of lithography. And there, my wife, Diane Fox, who photographs natural history museums, photographed the Museum of Hunting and Fishing, I think, in Munich. And they were very proud that they had a little display at the back and had an example of a Wolpertinger. And it's much like, I mean, there's a number of, I mean, the Americans have jackalopes and the Mexicans have some other dogs. I mean, and these hybrid animals are definitely something that come from some deep place in the human psyche. So yes, I'd love to go back to Munich and look for Wolperdingers. Maybe we can do it together.
Yeah, count me in on that expedition too.
Yeah, we should create a travel agency that goes around Europe looking for rare and a species, sort of like a snipe hunt or something.
Right, the Cryptozoological Travel Club. We'll found that right now.
I saw Simon Penny had a question earlier in the list. Gordy, I could address that too.
Okay, take it away.
So he's asking about the new book, Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. I haven't read the book yet, but it's interesting because my vision of Azudian culture was a kind of Garden of Eden culture with gods and goddesses involved in daily activities. And this notion, this sort of that the agricultural revolution, the Neolithic period, produced city-states and patriarchies and military, is one that, I mean, I created, my imaginary culture had no system of slavery, no system of military, and exist according to my narrative for over a millennia until the Hittites came and kind of wiped them out. But mostly they were able to foster productive relations with contemporary cultures, the Sumerians and so forth, through productive trade and so forth. So I'm looking forward to reading the book and interested in some of those ideas. But in fact, some of the ways I thought of the Azudians as a kind of utopian world based in agricultural economies. I mean, the same place that the poets recited poems is where they distributed produce. So I'm really interested in some of those ideas and sort of rethinking human history through that lens. So thanks for that question.
Well, we have another question from Brooke Day, and she asks, what is at stake when presenting the work alongside the narrative versus presenting the work with the narrative and with an artist's statement? Where's the line between creating something immersive and letting people in on the joke, so to speak?
So this is definitely something that Antoinette engages in her book. Like, where is the self-outing and where does it happen? So, you know, in Iris Haussler's projects, she, you know, she would do that at the end or later on. I've found that, there's different ways of sort of handling that. The folk art project was presented at, sometimes I would send the exhibiting institution 2 press releases. One would say, this is real, and the other would say it's a work of fictive art or parody. And sometimes, even if they said it was a work of fictive art or parody, they would have to add a sign at the beginning that says, this exhibit is entirely fictitious. And so they give it away on the front end because I guess they don't have faith and trust in the viewer to figure it out. I think having some faith in the viewer to figure it out is really important. And that there's a story, I just going through some of my earlier publications, I wrote a piece for Archaeology magazine in 1994 called The Art of the Trickster. And it was the experience of a retired librarian from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, who came to one of my exhibits. And she'd never heard of the Azudians, and then the person in the gallery gave her a publication on the history of Azudian ceramics, and then finally Hoax gave it away, right? And then she got to experience the exhibit again through a different kind of lens, because she was looking for the clues that she didn't get, or she had a rereading of it, so there's ways in which we willingly suspend our disbelief. I mean, there's interesting questions about consent, is it manipulative? I think a lot of these, and there's a lot of ethical questions that are connected to it, but I know, Brooke, you're pursuing artistic forms that involve fictive themes and so forth. And I think it's best to put the reveal, if you can, embed it and put it later on, and allow the viewer to have the experience of imagining it as real. And then having that, that insight, that aha moment, where what's the trigger, and they had gained some kind of insight. And I think that's one of the interesting potentials of fictive art.
What excites me the most about fictive art is it's truly a medium for our time and our place, our technology, our political madness, our coronavirus. What do you think your work says about people's recent mistrust of science or about fake news?
So Kevin Young has a great book he published in 2017. It's in the bibliography from Antoinette's book called Bunk, and it's about this history in America. I mean, from P.T. Barnum, Gulf of Tonkin, the Spanish-American. I mean, there's so many instances in which you could sell newspapers by telling tall tales. I mean, some of this relates to various forms of fake science. Whether it's about racial superiority and eugenics. I mean, so Bunk is really has a great sort of history of that. So while this is certainly a fictive art, is an art for our time, this isn't new. This kind of manipulations of information systems and public opinion and so forth have been going on for a while now. So I agree. It's definitely something for our time and has some currency. I think the real question, in relationship to, is the way there's elements of the non-rational. Jonathan Haidt writes about this. I mean, there's a kind of emotional connection, a tribalism to be against vaccines or against science. And maybe fictive art can work. I don't know, but clearly you're not going to persuade someone who's entrenched in their opinions about things. So I'm not sure. The strategy that I use, it's similar to Norman's, kind of probably grows out of the 60s and 70s in questioning authority and some of those sort of things. But hopefully it's the tools we need for today. I mean, the Yes Men is featured in Antoinette's book, and I brought them here at the University of Tennessee. And that's one strategy to sort of deal with this misinformation, right?
Antoinette, any final comments?
I myself suspect that one of the reasons this genre has really risen in the last 25, 30 years from a few scattered artists working here and there, like Norman Daly, to a genre where dozens and dozens of artists are making work that has fictive elements that are partially concealed and that attempt to deceive the audience to some degree, and then what I think is the important part of many of these projects, engage the audience in conversation as the unconcealing and revealing happens, is in part because we are stuck in a world where we have a lot of difficulties with information, finding good information, processing it, knowing what's good and bad, determining fakes from non-fakes. It is literally one of the major cultural problems of the day, and this is one of the things artists respond to. Sometimes they respond to it much more directly in works that address the question of fakery, and sometimes they do it in a more stealthy or indirect way, which is what I think fictive art and in all its flavors has been doing. So I want to thank you, David, for joining us on your father's behalf, and thank you, Beauvais, for joining us for this talk. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for coming as well. We really appreciate it.
Well, again, thank you all for joining us. And again, thanks to our guest, Beauvais Lyons, David Daly, and our host, Professor LaFarge. And again, many thanks to Carrie Patterson of Doppelhaus Press for publishing such a fine book, Sting in the Tail, Art, Hoax, and Provocation. Coming up in our series on fictive art, Professor LaFarge will speak with artist Greg Cohen on February 9th and artist Lenore Malin on March 2nd. Both discussions will begin at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Please join us. This is Gordy Grundy for artreporttoday.com.